All right. Sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties back there, but today I wanted to talk about autism, addiction, and anxiety. All of these are parts of my story that I don't really go over very much, but I do have a lot of experience with these topics, as well as dating and as well as borderline traits, probably even some narcissistic traits too. But I'm going to go over this today because I was watching someone on Threads. They were talking about autism, and I totally get that autism is a spectrum. There are severe versions and less severe versions, just like there is with narcissism. But with this person, like they were still speaking very clearly, and I wouldn't have thought it. Let's put it that way. And for me personally, if it wasn't for my massive supplement routine, I wouldn't be able to speak as clearly at all. And I wouldn't be able to look people in the eye. And it was just an awful experience for me. So like when I hear other people that say they've gone through the same thing, it makes me think, wow, my version must have been really severe then because it was just, it was wild. And I never got diagnosed with it either. It wasn't until I was like in my early 30s that I even begin to realize it. But once I got that and I figured it out, then everything made sense. But for me, it had started in high school because probably, especially around puberty, I had this severe anxiety that came out and I just wasn't comfortable. Like my everyday consciousness was extremely uncomfortable. And coming from a place now where my consciousness is much better, how we feel and our consciousness, especially when there's mental health involved or being on the spectrum involved, it is everything. And I'm super sensitive to all of this now, where if I'm in a good place with my mental health, everything can go well from there. But it doesn't take much for me to have like a bad mental health day sometimes. And if my supplement routine goes awry, then I'm not feeling like myself. But how I would describe it is a severe anxiety that would come out, especially so in social situations. And it's kind of like you can't see past it. Like it's you feel it with every fiber of your being. And it's like impossible to get through it, it feels like. And that's why I would love to drink and do drugs, because I could finally get that wall to come down, that layer of anxiety that would always come between me and everyone else. It would melt away. And so, of course, I gravitated towards those kinds of things because I had this severe anxiety. I didn't know what it was. I didn't realize it was anxiety. I didn't realize it would probably be what they call Asperger's, even though they don't say that's what it is anymore. They just consider that part of the autism spectrum. But for me, that's exactly how it was. I had this layer of anxiety that I saw the world through. I kind of see mental health as like sunglasses, where there can be sunglasses that are tinted with depression, sunglasses that are tinted with anxiety, sunglasses that are tinted with maybe bipolar, but it could be either one of those things. And for me, this has been the trade off I've had to make. So I take all of these supplements now, and they absolutely help with anxiety, though it might be slightly more depressing. I might have a little more depression, maybe, but not as much. But say if I were to stop treating the anxiety, depression may go away, but then anxiety comes back times 10. And that's not very fun at all. But going back to the things with the drinking and drugs. So it wasn't until I found opiates. That's what seemed to self medicate my anxiety the best. And so, of course, I gravitated to that. I gravitated that because when I took it, I could finally feel like a normal human being. I could feel like someone that could talk and be social and have fun. Whereas before, social situations were just extremely unpleasant for me. And it just sucked. It sucked, for lack of a better word. And like in high school, I was a big loner because of it. I didn't hang out with people, didn't go to the prom, didn't go to the JDD, didn't go to the sophomore cotillion because I just wasn't that comfortable. I wasn't comfortable in those social situations. And again, I wasn't someone that was diagnosed. Maybe if they would have given me that diagnosis at the time, things would have made sense. But no one did. No one did. So no one knew what was wrong with me. And it probably didn't help that I had a narcissistic parent and I had that kind of thing going on too. And then it probably didn't help that I was bullied a lot because I couldn't defend myself in high school. And what I mean by that is I just had no confidence, no self esteem, no assertiveness. Like the part of you that is needed to be confident and to be assertive, that part was broken in me, or it just wasn't there. And it's so hard to describe this to people that haven't been there themselves. It's similar to narcissistic abuse in that way, but with the autism piece, it's a kind of anxiety that unless you've experienced it, it's probably going to be really difficult for me to articulate it. And again, I've come a really far way with all of this. And I'm super grateful for my supplement routine that I'm even able to do what I do today. Because if it wasn't for this, I probably wouldn't be, honestly. So I'm super grateful for that. And it's a lot. It takes a lot. If someone has the kind of anxiety I have, it is not something that you're just going to be able to take a couple B vitamins and it's going to go away. It's like, no, it's a all encompassing routine full of probiotics, SAMe, magnesium, GABA, 5-HTP, tyrosine, taurine, phenylalanine, niacinamide, on and on. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, honestly. But for as bad as it was for me, I'm just grateful I found a solution. But around college is when the opiates really started to take hold for me, methadone in particular. And methadone is like a long-acting opiate. They give it to people that come off of heroin or other kinds of opiates, like maybe painkillers, etc. But I loved it because it medicated my anxiety for long periods of time. And I was able to feel like a normal human being. So I did that. And then I went there. And from that point on, opiates were some bad news, let me tell you, because when I didn't have them, the withdrawal was pretty bad. And so I had gone to rehab when I was, I think, 19 years old. And it's like, have you even lived if you haven't had to spend a month with strangers that you don't know of all ages when you're 19 years old? So what happened to me was I was on methadone, but then I switched to Oxycontin. And I was at WVU at the time. And I was going out with this older woman who was a stripper. And so we would just basically be hooligans together. And I blew my student loan refund check on drugs, of course. And I was supposed to give it to my parents, but of course I didn't. So I was just ripping and running. And then I had called, I think, my mother drunkenly one night. And I was like, yep, I spent it. I spent it on drugs and alcohol. And they cried and they took me from school and then sent me to rehab. But at this point, I wasn't ready to get better because at this point, I didn't know what my problem was. I didn't know I had anxiety. I didn't know that I was probably on the spectrum. I didn't know any of this stuff. I just knew that my normal consciousness didn't feel good. I knew that my everyday self, I just wanted to jump out of my skin because it was so uncomfortable. So I went to the rehab. And, there's people there that are bikers. There's people there that are business people. I still remember some of them. I'm 39 now, so this is 20 years ago now. And ironically, it's probably almost 20 years to the date that I went to rehab. And I remember this because it was right after the New England versus the Eagles Super Bowl in 2005. And I had gone there. And of course, I just met all of the wrong people because I wasn't ready. And so I snuck through the cracks because my version of autism / neurodivergence was just being super quiet. And when you're super quiet, people don't realize there's something wrong with you. Like I had all this internal angst, for lack of a better word. And this is why I think, like, some people say autism can turn into borderline if it's undiagnosed and they're just treating you like a normal person. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of my symptoms were congruent with borderline as well. I was extremely impulsive. I had black and white thinking. I would rant and rave on drugs and alcohol. Suicidal idealizations, depression, mood swings, unstable sense of self. That was the biggest one for me, unstable sense of self. I would try to pretend to be people I wasn't all the time. I would like pretend I was movie characters sometimes. So again, I don't know if that was a proper diagnosis for me either, but I certainly had borderline traits. And I was at this rehab and I finally left AMA, against medical advice. And this guy that was there before me, he came and picked me up. And that was the first day that I did H because I wasn't ready to do better. All I wanted was to alleviate that uncomfortable feeling that I had. And so I did. And that set me on the path of another rocky 6 months there. And I got in trouble with the law. And that was another big thing that went wrong. And I was going off the rails until they finally put me on Suboxone. And that kind of stabled me out for a little while. And Suboxone is something they give people that is like methadone, except not as it's not an opioid agonist as much as methadone is. So, but it was able to stabilize me, where I was able to go to school and at least finish. But I absolutely still acted out in other ways. I still drank and did other drugs, etc. But it got me that baseline down where I was at least able to continue. And then finally that went on for a while. And that's where I got introduced to like AA and NA. And that did really help me for a while. And then I got off of Suboxone, and that was horrific. Let me tell you, that was 2 weeks, if not more, of hell. And then after that, I was left so raw and sensitive. And the Suboxone, what it was doing at the time was it was medicating my anxiety. I just didn't realize it. The same thing I was doing with all the rest of my drugs of abuse, etc. It was self-medicating my anxiety and my depression. And before that, they had me on things like antipsychotics as well. And I don't know how I survived some of this stuff because I was sleep driving to school like an hour. And my parents would say to the psychiatrist, like, he seems to be over medicated. He's falling asleep. I was like a cat sleeping 16 hours a day. And the psychiatrist would just say, no, they're getting used to the medicine. But meanwhile, I'm lucky I didn't freaking die on this stuff. And this is probably why also now I have a healthy mistrust of the psychiatry world, because I know it happened to me. Like, they don't know. They only know what they read, some of these people. Like, they don't know what these drugs actually do in your system unless they're taking them themselves. They know what they observe and they know what they read, but it's a completely different ball game actually taking them. But I was able to get off of that stuff. And then I was left with myself again. And I still wasn't doing very good with that. And that's where I was kind of like a love addict. And I was extremely codependent at the time, a massive people pleaser, full of anxiety. And at this moment, all I had wanted was a woman to make it all better for me. And this is when I was about 25 years old. And the more I wanted that, the more I would repel people, and especially women, because especially at that age, confidence, charisma, and fun is what is attractive at that point. But since I stopped using at that point too, I never had that temporary reprieve. Like when you're in your 20s, that's what people do. You know, you go out and about, you drink, you have fun, you do whatever. And you at least, if you have anxiety like I did, you self-medicated at the time, and you're at least able to not feel it for a while. But I didn't do that. I was clean for several years back then. And I would say it was very helpful because I was going to NA at the time. And that's where I learned so much about myself. I learned about my shortcomings, my defects. And that's why I learned so much about like my issues. I was writing them down. I was like, oh, what's your problem, Jared? Oh, you can be pretty jealous. You're very competitive. You're always comparing yourself, all of these things that were just not good. But that's what I was doing at the time. But I really adhered to the NA program like a religious fanatic. And I was probably not fun to be around at the time because I was anal. I was what they would call an NA Nazi. And it was what I needed at the time because when I strictly adhered to that program, I felt okay. But, you know, I did that for a while. And then finally, as I started to discover supplements, that's when I kind of started leaving NA, because what had happened was the path became narrow. So I was going to meetings, I was working the steps, talking to a sponsor, doing all these things that they told me to do. Because at the time, they just told me I'm an addict. Oh, you're just an addict. Once too many, a thousand's never enough. You need to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, talk to your sponsor, work the steps, get a home group, get in service. And so those are all the things I did. And I'm glad I did them. But I realize now that wasn't the only issue with me at the time. Because, like I said, no one knew. Like when they gave me these antipsychotics when I was in my lower 20s, no one told me what my diagnosis was. They didn't say, oh, you're taking this for bipolar. You're taking this because you're on the spectrum, or you're taking this for anxiety or depression. They didn't tell me anything. They just said, here you go, just take these. And I guess what they thought was, well, this guy might kill himself if we don't put him on something. And sure, that was a possibility. I mean, when you're doing dope at the time, it's not as deadly as it is now, but people were still dying for sure. So when it's that bad, and certainly the side effects of some of this stuff can be bad too, but when it's that bad, they say, hey, what's the worst that can happen? So they did it, and luckily I survived, because I almost did die many times sleep driving to school, which was madness thinking about it. But so I finally discovered supplements, because while I was clean, I wasn't drinking caffeine, I wasn't smoking cigarettes, I wasn't drinking, no drugs. I even tried to get rid of sugar, but that was the hardest one. But I still had massive anxiety and was having suicidal idealizations. I was like, what the hell's wrong with me? Like, I was in great shape, sleeping well, eating well, no sugar, no caffeine, no cigarettes, no drugs. And there was still something wrong with me. Like, I still felt awful. And I was like, I can still joke about that sometimes today, that my superpower can be, I can still be depressed and still be in great shape and all these things. And it's why I know it's not the only thing. Like Rogan will say, oh, all you have to do is work out and eat well and your depression will go away. Well, not always. Not always. And maybe it's because of the borderline. Maybe it's because of the autism. And I've also had several concussions as well. And I don't know how much that contributes to it too. I don't know. Who's to say? When you've had as many things going on as me, who's to say what's doing what anymore? I don't know. I don't know. What's from bullying? What's from autism? What's from anxiety? What's from drug abuse? What's from narcissistic abuse? What's from getting jumped and assaulted? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But what I like to think is all of those things made me into who I am today. I don't try to consider myself a victim in any way today. And that doesn't mean that things are perfect for me now. Absolutely not. I can still have a bad day on any given day. And some of the things that help me, I might say, could gravitate towards what I would sometimes call toxic positivity. I'll use it for myself, but I try not to use that for others, because I know how obnoxious it can be. I know how invalidating and dismissive it can be. But there's a fine line with that. Like, my rule is I can push myself with that, but I don't want to push other people with that. But to get back, so I started taking the supplements, and I finally started to get a little bit of relief from the massive anxiety. And again, it's so hard to explain this anxiety, that of my version of it, unless you've been there. And like, it was a lot. I mean, there's a reason why I was doing what I was doing with drinking and drugs at the time, because it was the only time I wanted to really be alive. When I wasn't on something, I just wanted to be dead, because I just was so pigeonholed. It was sad. But and that's why I say it's different. Like, people talk about anxiety, people talk about depression, and I hear them talking about it, and I'm like, I don't know what it is, but mine just seems like it was pretty bad in comparison, and my life had the consequences to show it. But I started taking these supplements probably in my late 20s, went back to school for mental health counseling. I had already completed addictions counseling stuff at the time. And the best description for me in mental health was, before I took a supplement routine, the ceiling of my potential was just lower. And I just couldn't reach it. But then as I started adding supplements, it felt like the ceiling of my potential was getting higher, and parts of my brain were getting put together that were just broken before or like unplugged. And then I would take supplements and it would plug them in. And it took many years for me to find this routine. But things like SAM-E would really help, tyrosine, 5-HTP, a couple different probiotics, vitamin D3, a black seed oil, all these things. They're all like little bits and pieces of the puzzle that add up to who I am today. And I'm super grateful for all of that. But it's also super humbling too, because if my supplement routine isn't right, it's like I just don't feel right. And that's one of the hardest things to deal with now, is that I can be very mood dependent to do things. And I have to be really good. Like I can't be acting out with drinking or even gambling or things like that, because that can really take me off of my game. But like when I'm not in the right mood, it's really difficult for me to push through, which it's absolutely a limiting factor. Like if we're only going to be able to do things when we feel like it or we have the drive to do so, it's going to be really difficult to succeed. Like we got to be able to find a way to push through on our not so good feeling days. But I feel like when there's mental health involved, it's that way, except it's even harder. And that's not an excuse. I don't try to use any of these things as an excuse. I try to act like I'm just like everybody else. Because, and to me, that's also the benefit of never being diagnosed as well. Like, yeah, there were certainly some pitfalls for sure, but I'm glad I was treated like everyone else. And yeah, there were some negatives to that too, for sure, with the bullying and whatever. But I'm glad people didn't coddle me for that reason. Like, I think my mother coddled me a little bit, but it wasn't like, oh, because he's on the spectrum, so we have to treat him differently. No, I just never really been a fan of that. So people treated me like I was normal, for better or for worse. And I think I developed in a certain way because of that. And whenever I say things like that, it reminds me of my aunt's funeral, where someone was at there and they had said, what did they say? So a guy said to her, my aunt passed away. And there was a guy at the funeral that he had lost his mother and his wife within the same month. And he had said, because my aunt had a brain aneurysm and died at 46. And he was probably around 40 something or so at the time. And he had remembered that my aunt was the only person that when his mother and his wife died within the same month, that she was the only one that treated him the same. Like everyone else was treating him differently, walking around his feelings, etc. But my aunt treated him as if nothing had happened. And that's really what he respected and appreciated. So that always stood out to me. And that was 22 years ago now that he had said that. But I think the analogy of it is, I think there's something to that with some of the mental health stuff too. It's like, if you're not so severe off that you're mute or something, if you're just treated like you're everybody else, you're not going to be, it's not going to be as bad, I don't think. There's going to be something good that happens in that. And again, not all good. It's not going to be black or white, but there's something I think that you'll be able to make it through, I think. But that's just my opinion. I'm not saying that's cut and dry. But the reason I even wanted to talk about all this is because it's things that I go through. And when I talk about the narcissism topic and narcissistic abuse, I mean, that's a part of my story. Like I've been through that, but there are reasons why it's a part of my story. There is a thing where I believe narcissistic people are absolutely attracted to autistic people sometimes, because they can sense that the autistic person isn't as good with boundaries and being articulate. And often they try to see the best in people. They're very straightforward and they can be people pleasers. And there's many forms of people pleasers too. Like I've been seeing people on Instagram talk about how people pleasers think they're more powerful than they really are. They're just afraid people are going to see them as a piece of crap. To which I don't necessarily completely agree with that all the time. I think there's many versions of people pleasers. There's a character disordered people pleaser, the one that's more Machiavellian. They're in charge, in control, and they're really just manipulating people to get what they want. And then there's the neurotic form of people pleasing. These are the people that are anxiety ridden, and whenever they stood up for themselves before, they would get guilt, shame, etc. So those people pleasing behaviors are not coming from nothing. They're coming because whenever they would stand up for themselves, they got punished. And, some people might call that a trauma response, but whatever you want to call it, that's one of the ways it can absolutely happen. So let me see. Douglas says, it's very interesting. I'm glad you're doing well now. Thanks for sharing. I wish you well. Appreciate you, Douglas. Simple Life says, thank you for sharing. Simple Life always reminds me of Simple Man, Leonard Skinner. But the last several days here, I haven't quite felt like myself. I was doing pretty well there for a while. But the last few days, I don't know what's going on with me, but not feeling like as sure of myself as I always am. And yeah, sometimes I have some bad days still too. But I totally get it. I might start talking more about these autistic issues, or maybe the addiction issues, or borderline issues. I'm also really into the dating issues too, because when you're autistic trying to date, especially someone that looks as I look, people don't think, oh yeah, he's going to be on the spectrum. So like, I think I'm an okay looking person, but people expect certain things from you when you're an okay looking person. They think, oh, he's got to be cocky, confident, funny, charismatic. But when you're on the spectrum, it's just not that way. So like, they see you and they expect you to be a certain way, and then you're not that way. So it kind of messes with them a little bit. And I get it. I get it coming from where I am now. And again, I'm much better than I used to be. But there's probably little things that I still do that I'm not even aware of. There's other women that have been on the spectrum. They told me, it's like, oh, Jared, I can see it. I can see it from maybe your body language. And some other people can see it even from my YouTube videos. I don't know if it's like from lack of facial expressions or something, or blinking. People comment on that sometimes to make fun of me, but that does happen. And maybe it's a neurodivergent thing. I don't know. But all of those things have absolutely contributed. But the dating part, that's why I got super into it, because it was kind of a weird kind of hell where I was obsessed with dating into women. But for as obsessed as I was that unsuccessful too, because I just didn't have the qualities that people were attracted to. Yeah, I mean, I've had a good homeostasis for a while. Feel like myself is an interesting phrase, implies a homeostasis. Yeah, I mean, I've had one, but Stephen King has a quote, right? You never feel your sanity leave, you only feel its return. So I can be going good, and then if things don't go good, it's like, oh my goodness, like this feels like it's come out of nowhere. And you got to like find your footing again. And like whenever your consciousness changes, you got to find your footing again as it changes. And I've gone through a good stretch here of being in a pretty good consciousness. So like, I got to just be grateful of that, where I hadn't been depressed, hadn't been anxiety. And for me, that's humongous. And I think I was able to have the production to show for that too. I was doing well. But depending, it can go off the rails. It can certainly go off the rails sometimes. And when things go off the rails, it's not pretty. It's not pretty. And it starts with like how you feel. And you see that you got the lens. It's either the depression lens or the anxiety lens, or like a combination of both. Neither one of them are fun. But again, I've gone through a good spell of being in a good place. Like the last couple days, I'm trying to get my footing because I haven't been feeling the best. So, but this too shall pass. And these were those silly sayings that I learned in NA and other places. This is where they come in handy, because when you're not feeling good, that's what you hold on to. This too shall pass. Pain shared is pain lessened. Reach out to somebody. Talk about how you're doing. And still to this day, these are the things I learned in NA. And whenever I'm going through it, it's my go-to. It's my go-to that I do. And so when I do some of these lives like this is what I'm doing. I'm like letting it out, because it's been ingrained to me. And I'm careful who I do this with now too, because I don't do it with everybody, because not everyone is going to be a good listener with it. But I feel like when I do it this way, the people who are on the other end they can relate to it and they can identify with it. And maybe they won't feel as alone. It's the same thing about sharing about narcissistic stuff, because when you're in an abusive relationship, you probably feel alone. You feel confused. You feel like you're the only one going through it. So when you hear someone else going through the same thing, going through the same behaviors, going through the same insanity, it gives you some hope. Wow, I'm not the only one going through this. So it's still what I do, because that's what they taught me in NA. You got to share what's going on. And at that point, it was really just, I thought I was an addict, and I was going through it with that mentality, just an addict. So this is what I got to do. And again, it was helpful for the time, but there becomes a limit to it as well. So Douglas says, a notable feeling for me is an occasional lethargy or restlessness. I cannot imagine some of the challenging, extended negative, not oneself feelings you are experiencing. Well, I appreciate that. Again, it's hard to say, right? No one can know what someone else is feeling. You can only see how it presents itself into the world. But it's been a lot. There's been a lot of great days, and there's been a lot of dark days too, for that matter. But when you're in a position like me now, like I've been building up my social media presences on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and because I am where I am, it seems more worth it. Like, okay, all that madness and insanity and ups and downs and the parents being so disappointed in you, etc. Well, maybe it's for something. Maybe it wasn't for nothing. And I'll remember sayings like the calm sea never made a skilled sailor. And that's how I try to see it today, so I can be the best version of myself today. Because again, what would be the point in seeing it any other way? Like, that's my thoughts on the matter. It's like, I could be woe's me. I could be, oh, why me? This sucks. Everyone to try to cater to me and how I feel, but that doesn't help me. Like, who does that help? Like, it's giving into a part of myself that just wants to complain. And I have been doing that a little bit in other things. I've been complaining about sports. I've been complaining about crypto. But I'm noticing in myself now, those are the things that I shouldn't be doing. Like, you can be investing in crypto, that's fine. But complaining about it and like scrolling through the forums, like, that's not what I need to be doing. That's me succumbing to a weaker part of myself. And I gotta try to focus on those things that are going to be good for me. Sharing like this is good for me. Reading, that's good for me. Hanging out with some friends and talking to people, that's good for me. Enriching my spirit, that's good for me. But now we all have our phones here. And I'll tell you, our phones can be a double-edged sword for sure. I spend way too much time on my phone every day. And part of it's because of what I do, or at least maybe that's an excuse I have for myself. But I post all throughout the day. And I get, it's part of my job now too. But there's productive scrolling and then there's unproductive scrolling. And it's up to us to determine which one is which. But there's all sorts of sin, gambling, pornography, violence, mindless social media debates that do no good. It's like, you got to be really mindful of where our attention is going. There's good ways for it to go, positive directions, and not so positive directions. But again, if you want to hear me talk about more of the autism stuff, addiction stuff, anxiety stuff, depression stuff, I've been through all of it, even the borderline stuff. And the autism and borderline stuff is probably why I understand the narcissistic stuff so well too. Like, I have like hints of them. I got hints of borderline, hints of narcissistic traits. So enough so that I can understand it. But it's definitely not the same. Like, my version would be more of the autistic is the main presentation. And then other things because of that have occurred. Because of not being diagnosed, then that made it look more like borderline. And then when I was wild, I'm sure I looked more narcissistic too when I was wild and immature. But that's where the steps really did well for me too. I was able to learn self-awareness. I was able to learn, okay, this is how you get honest. This is how you admit when you're wrong. This is how you have humility. This is how you share about it, you talk about it, and that's how you get through it. And that was an invaluable skill. Like, and I bet you those rooms, they helped people. They helped people of all diagnoses. They helped borderlines, people on the spectrum, bipolar people, CPTSD, even narcissistic people were probably helped. And for them, as long as they stayed clean, a lot of their behaviors could probably improve. Now, could they cure the narcissism? Absolutely not. Although there are some therapists who claim they could. I'm skeptical of that myself. But if they were able to stay clean and did behavior modification, I think that's possible. But just like with addiction, like once you have narcissism, your brain's different. And I don't think you can fix that. And that's why they would say in NA, once you're an addict, you're always an addict. And that's why you got to keep on coming back. Now, I don't necessarily subscribe to that anymore, but I did at the time. But again, what would that also apply to? That would also apply to narcissism. Like, yeah, that part's not going anywhere, but you can continue to manage it. And that's how they treated addiction. You can continue to manage your addiction. So that part would make sense too. But yeah, it's been a wild road, and I have all these other things I could be talking about as well with the dating and etc. So I enjoy talking about the dating topic. I just haven't talked about it as much. I was caught up in the narcissism content here because that's what people wanted to hear about. But I also think that side of things is getting pretty saturated now. So I'm getting tired of it. And I go in bouts of inspiration with it. But it just depends. It just depends because on one hand, it's part of the business. But on the other hand, it's like, well, where should I really be putting my attention? Is this really where I should be putting my attention? I think sometimes, yes. But I don't think it's the only place. And I'm trying to work out for myself where my attention should be going also. So yeah, I'll talk about narcissism, but what else? Should I be leaning towards the dating world? Maybe the political world? Maybe mental health, anxiety, depression, addiction? I'm not sure. But part of the reason I'm doing this video here is because I just want to see what people say about it. I want to see what the feedback is. The past is vanity. We learn from it. We can only move forward. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. A person who does their best with the knowledge they have will have minimal regrets. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once it's happened, it's like there's something to learn and an opportunity in everything. And that's really it. Like, we did it. What are we going to do with it? We can either learn from it and try to find the opportunity, or we can be just a victim and woe's me. I don't like the victim way. Although I understand the feeling, I try not to entertain it. I try to move forward and say, okay, what do I learn? What's the opportunity here? And I've done a pretty good job with it, but there's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. No matter who you are, there's room for improvement. And then, like I said, part of the room for improvement for me is I'm going to try to do more longer videos on YouTube, less shorts on YouTube. Shorts may be going to the other platforms more so. But on YouTube, the advantage of YouTube is these longer form videos. The advantage to YouTube is interviews. Like, this is something that's fairly exclusive to YouTube. And Rumble, I guess, too. But Rumble is not even in the same league as YouTube right now. So I got to maximize like the business stuff of this because that's just where I am. It has to be that way at this point. And part of growing up, like, I never wanted to have to do that as much with this, but it's turning into that's what I got to do. So I got to find a way to make it work. No excuses. But I've spoken a while here. I'm going to try to hit the gym here before I get too tired. Gym is a big thing for me. I got to hit the gym 3 or 4 times a week, or no matter what my supplement routine is, I'm not going to be feeling my best. Sleep, super important to me too, but That's part of my routine. And yeah, the gym might not cure your mental health, but I've never felt worse after the gym. We'll put it that way. As long as I actually did the workout, I've never felt worse. But again, thanks for watching. If you got this far, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And let me know what you want to see me talk about more. Do you want to just see me talk about narcissism? Would you want to hear me talk more about addiction stuff or being on the spectrum, Asperger's, anxiety, depression, borderline, even my experience with borderline? Let me know, and I'll try to give you all more of what you want. So with that, thank you very much for watching. But one more thing. It doesn't seem practical to wallow in being a victim, but I live a very comfortable life relative to many. What do I know? It isn't very practical to wallow in being a victim. It's not. It's a feeling, but feelings are not always fact. It can be an unpleasant feeling. And when we're not feeling sharp, we might be tempted to dwell in it because we're all human, but we got to try to snap out of it. But I do like the sayings like depression has a hard time hitting a moving target. Again, that won't cure depression, but it does help. I'm all about things that will help. And I think when we have like sayings that we can say to ourselves, it can really go a far way. But as I say these things, I think of the pushback people give me. So when I would say depression has a hard time hitting a moving target, people are like, no, you must not understand depression to say that. It's like, dude, I've been there. I understand. I just try to see it in ways that help me to be the best version of myself. It's like, I could also say, yeah, depression sucks, it's terrible, and sometimes there's nothing you can do. And while true, I don't think that's a helpful thing to really put at the forefront of your mind. It's like, how is that going to help you? Is it going to help you? And just because I believe depression has a harder time hitting a moving target doesn't mean I always adhere to that perfectly. There's going to be times where I might wallow or feel depressed, but I try to strive towards that principle. Yes, I'm not going to be perfect with it. But I'm going to keep on trying to put one foot in front of the next. And I think that's the things with people who get really black and white with it. They think if you believe depression has a harder time hitting a moving target, you have to be perfect with it. It's like, no one's going to be perfect with it. You just try to strive for things because why wouldn't you? And it doesn't mean that we don't have our bad days still, but we try to think in a way that makes it so that we have the least bad days possible. And I'm a big advocate of we got to act our way into a better way of thinking. But that's just me. That's just me. But again, I'll try that out. I do eat a lot of meat, but I'm not strictly meat. But it's something to try out. Diet, sleep, exercise, supplements. I'm all for it. But alrighty, I'm over and out here. You guys have a good night.